Let the poor breathe. Don't suffocate them.
Bola Ahmed Tinubu is known by many names. He's been a senator, of course, he's the president right now, but his supporters also call him the Asiwaju of Lagos. They call him the master strategist. Now, a lesser known fact about Tinubu is that he actually wrote a book. Yes, Tinubu is an author. In 2012, he wrote a book called Financialism. Whatever opinions you have about Tinubu, I have to say that this book is an intelligently written book. Now, I should say that the book was co-written with a Black American called Brian Brown. Brian Brown served as the U.S. Consul General in Nigeria between 2003 and 2007. Now, the book borders on political economy. Now, context. The book premises its arguments on the 2008 financial crisis in the US and in Nigeria. If you remember very well, around 2008, 2009, 2010, there was a global economic crunch at the time. I remember I was in secondary school at that time, and so it was reported in the news every day. You know, stock prices were down. A lot of people lost their jobs. A lot of people lost their homes in the US. And Nigeria also had its own domestic financial problem around that same time. Now, both of them try to link the financial crisis in the US and the financial crisis in Nigeria, and they drew similarities. If you think about economic systems, everybody knows what socialism is, everybody knows what capitalism is, everybody knows what communism is. But both of them defined another kind of economic system called financialism. Now, they argue that financialism is when capitalism goes extreme. The US prides itself as a free market. You know, you find a lot of American political pundits, American writers argue that America is the land of free market. What that means is they do not want governments to regulate, you know, the market. They don't want government to intervene in the market, pretty much. And so they argue if you don't want the government to intervene in the market, capitalism is going to go extreme. Ordinarily, when you have a capitalist system, it means you produce something and you get rewarded for that. In financialism, they argue that money, instead of being a yardstick for measuring wealth, money has now become wealth. It is a celebration of money without necessarily producing anything. And that was a problem with the 2008 financial crisis, both in the US and in Nigeria. The Obasanjo administration in a second term came up with a bold economic policy. The Obasanjo administration wanted Nigeria to be among the top leading 20 economies in the world by 2020. And then it figured out that the way to go about it was to build our banking sector in such a way that our banks would be able to loan money to the real sector of the economy. If people have access to credit, they can then invest that and boost production and grow the economy. And the way they went about it was through a policy called bank consolidation. So at the time, Nigeria had roughly about 90 commercial banks. And so they came up with the bank consolidation policy, which mandated that banks must have a minimum of 25 billion naira in capitalization. At that time, the requirement was just 2 billion naira. But with the policy, they were mandated to have a minimum of 25 billion naira. And so most of those banks merged. The consequence of that policy was from 90 banks, we had 25 banks, you know. Now, the idea again was the bigger the banks were in terms of capitalization, you know, the more they could lend to the real sector, the more they could lend to, you know, oil and gas, to manufacturing and all these real sectors. And by lending to them, that would in turn boost the economy. Unfortunately, those 25 banks did not do that. If anything, they were investing in themselves. They engaged in speculative trading, they engaged in stock trading. They were giving out calls to members of the public to buy their shares, to invest, you know, in their shares. A lot of the profits the banks were declaring at that time were exaggerated. So they made so much money to the point that bank executives began to buy private jets. The banks at the time also engaged in what is called margin loans. So a margin loan is when you borrow money from the bank, and instead of investing that money you borrow from the bank, you invest that money into stocks. So many people engaged in margin loans at the time. So it was unsustainable to the point that the entire thing crashed. So that led to the financial crisis we had in Nigeria at the time. So what's the argument of this book? What's the argument of both Bola Ahmed Tinubu and Brian Brown? They argue that saying that the government should not intervene in the economy is a wrong thing to say, as evidenced by the financial crisis in America and Nigeria, number one. And number two, the way to grow the economy is not through the financial sector. The financial sector can actually be rich, but other sectors can be poor. And in fact, even today, that's the situation in Nigeria. It was said that about 5 banks declared more than 4 trillion naira in profits just last year. I mean, the financial sector in Nigeria is actually wealthy. You can't say the same for other sectors of the economy. The wealth in the financial sector does not necessarily translate into wealth in other sectors. So they argue the best way to grow the economy is through production, is through industrialization. Since Tinubu came into power in 2023, do you think he has been able to live up to the ideas he argued in this book? In what way would you say Tinubu has done anything to boost production in the country? In what way would you say Tinubu has done anything to encourage industrialization in Nigeria?